Okay, we are going live. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome on ArchiDiaries for the fourth interview in our ongoing live interview series that has been titled as Shades of Green 3.0 Sustainable Building Approaches. I'm really glad to share that for our fourth interview, today we have with us an architect from Uganda, architect Felix Holland. He's a co-founder and principal architect at Localworks. Felix, welcome on ArchiDiaries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. So before I hand it over to Felix for his presentation, please allow me to introduce Felix and Localworks for our viewers. Felix Holland is co-founder and principal architect at Localworks, a multidisciplinary design and build collaborative based in Kampala, Uganda. Felix grew up in Germany, where he attended a Rudolf-Steiner-School and later studied architecture at HfbK in Hamburg. In 2004, he moved to Uganda, where he joined a British firm of architects and engineers. After 8 years, Felix started his own practice, Studio FH Architects. In 2019, the firm became a founding member of the Localworks Collaborative, which specializes in design and realization of green architecture. Felix is married and has 3 daughters. So please allow me to welcome Felix. And Felix, can we please have your presentation?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invite. Let me share my screen. Just checking that you can see it.
Yes, Felix, it's perfectly visible.
Great. So I've named my little presentation the How question, Appropriate Architecture for Uganda. And I think that shows you already that I'm going to try to talk about the process as much as perhaps the outcome of it. First of all, for all those who are not entirely familiar with the map of Africa and where Uganda exactly is, you see it there, and then highlighted within Uganda is Kampala, right in the central south, on the shores of Lake Victoria. This is Localworks. This is our team, and down there you see a few photos of the office. We're all working under one roof. We're trying to be as practical and as applied as possible, and you know, getting designers to be builders and getting builders to be designers is one of the things that we are keen on. Maybe before I talk about the how, I'm going to talk about the why. Why are we green architects? Many of you will have seen this this graphic or this statistics. It's quite a staggering number, really. 39% of global CO2 emissions are caused by the building or the construction sector. And this, of course, also includes road infrastructure and such things. But nevertheless, I think it is quite an interesting statistic, because it shows us as architects that we do have something to do and something to say within the fight against climate change. I'm going to start my presentation in the northeastern corner of Uganda. There is a national park called Kidepo, and this is where we were building 2 primary schools. The park is here highlighted in brown. It actually crosses the border into South Sudan. But the real interesting starting point for this project is what is shown there in yellow, and that is a wildlife corridor that especially elephants are using during the dry season on their search for water. So they move out of the park boundaries, they move south, and there is constantly some clashes between human, habitation and wildlife. And our client, the African Wildlife Foundation, was called in to help. And they developed something called a land use plan. And that land use plan entailed that some of the population would move out of that corridor, would be relocated in a valley nearby, and would then receive a number of support actions, including the construction of schools. It's a wonderful park, a beautiful savanna park, bordered by a beautiful mountain range, actually 2 ranges on either side of it, moving in north-south direction. Beautiful kopjes, granite, stone, dotted around. You can see the beautiful grayish, brownish, rusty tone of the granite. And then a local typology that's quite interesting, where the walls do not actually support the roof. There is actually a row or a circle of poles around the wall that are supporting these roofs. You can see that here as well. You actually step down into the building. It's also quite interesting. As in all projects, when we start, we do quite an in-depth site visit. Here we spent 4 days on site. We met the community of both schools. We walked both sides. We walked the entire vicinity. We looked for materials. We looked for typologies. We looked for anything really that might inspire us for our project. And we then developed with time a concept that distinguished the 2 schools not in the buildings. We decided to build, basically to develop one type of building, one type of classroom building, but to approach the 2 sites very differently. One of the 2 sites is right by the park entrance, and one of the 2 sites is in that new valley that I just mentioned. So the idea here was that in the park, we would really now try to be inspired by the typical manyatta, as it's called in East Africa, the sort of the homestead. And you can see that these roundish curves of the perimeters that are around the building. And then in the second school, a place called Sarachom, the decision was, or the idea was, to create a farm school. So you can see how everything is a bit more linear, and the idea is that the school itself can actually be designed as if it was a demonstration garden, or it actually is a demonstration garden. This is a typical classroom block with 2 classrooms. You can see here that we decided to utilize that stone that we found in the lower levels, both for the foundations and for the plinth walls. And then we built the walls using compressed earth blocks with material mined on site. And obviously you can see that we were inspired by the roof structure that is on the outside, and then developed this idea of a lightweight steel truss that spans across the classroom. Stone foundations is something that we do a lot. It makes so much sense in many ways to utilize stone, especially, of course, when you are in remote places such as this. But it has many other advantages. It is, of course, a material that is does not really have any capillary action. So if you have any material above it, such as earth walls, then of course you are very concerned about any moisture from the ground. Stone has great properties in that sense. And it is, of course, something that's very labor-intensive, and we're always interested in labor-intensive technologies, because part of what we're trying to do is really to generate employment. What was particularly interesting about the stone on this side was that we actually asked the local population, in fact the parents of the school, of the future parents, we asked them to actually supply these stones to the contractor. So they were asked to collect them in their gardens and on their land, and to then effectively sell it to the contractor. So in that sense, the local community had another direct benefit through the project. Then we make the blocks on site. In both schools had very good properties, good soil property. So given the distance to Kampala here in Uganda, most of the building materials are otherwise procured in Kampala. Given that distance, it was of course very important that we found something that is that can be made on site to a very great extent. And then there are some images here that you can see how we utilize these CEB blocks, these compressed earth blocks, partially in a breeze wall, hit and miss arrangement, and then a ring beam where we created essentially channels through which the reinforcement then runs. The steel is obviously a material that we do not always use in our projects. In this case, we always look at each project individually and then choose the right material. I guess the key reason here was that there are quite some aggressive termites in this area, and we did not want to use timber as our primary structural material. But then what we do is, if we do use high energy materials such as steel, we then like to use it in a very, very sparing way. So you can see here that these trusses are very lightweight. It's a 7-meter span, and 2 people can lift it and can still smile while they lift it. And these are really profiles that we would ordinarily more use for windows, little angles and little hollow sections, so that we really try to reduce the weight as much as possible. You can see that the moment you do use local materials that you find around the site, there is a good likelihood that you will end up blending quite well into the landscape. And given that these are conservation schools, where the importance of conservation and the importance of wildlife is part of the curriculum, in that aspect is very, very important for us that is also reflected in the architecture. That is the local typical jewelry, and I think you can see how we try to utilize that in our color scheme for our windows, or should I say shutters, because these are actually glassless shutters. The idea being that they are really open throughout, apart from through very heavy storms and at night. There was quite some learning curve around the stonework. Dry stack is not something that is very common here, and it wasn't easy to find masons and to train masons to do this sort of work that we are looking for. The classrooms are very open, window sills are very, very low. The idea being that really when you sit in there, you really experience nature as well. Whether the kids really walk always through the doors, we didn't really mind so much. They can walk through the windows as well. This is a typical classroom. You see we use bamboo for the ceiling, and then we have a little slot, a little translucent roof sheet slot just above the blackboard that adds some bit of vertical direct light into these classrooms. This is the amphitheater, the little sort of the compromise of an assembly hall, and the toilet in the background. The second project that I want to show is still in eastern Uganda, but in the southern part of eastern Uganda. That's a place called Kamuli. And here we were asked to design a rural or an agricultural training center. This is a project by Iowa State University from the US, who have a cooperation program with the local university here, and they operate this center both for research and for some form of outreach. We were called to see this site. It's a very elongated site, as you can see there. Has the lowest part of it in a wetland, and is accessed from the highest point, not particularly steep, views out towards south. And we developed a certain zoning program that we felt made a lot of sense, where we kept the services right at the top of the site, including some staff accommodation. Then we had a zone for research and communal functions, then accommodation, then agriculture and sports, and finally forestry. This is the site plan. The site actually had quite some natural forest, you could say, or at least, grown-up trees on the western part of it. And we then decided to form these courtyards that are partially surrounded by trees and partially out in the open landscape. All in all, we decided to break it up into 3 courtyards. This is one of them. This is actually the main building at the top of the site. And these are essentially 2 L-shaped blocks that create a space in between. One on the left has the dining, kitchen and such things, and then on the right we have a living room area, the social functions, as well as an office building. We chose as our language sort of gently sloping roofs that kind of follow the terrain in an organic way. As our primary material, we utilize brick, clay brick, and the idea here was to use a particularly textured type of brick on the outside, and then on the inside towards the courtyard, you'll see that we actually didn't use any brick. We utilized color and sort of painted plaster and timber. The idea with brick is really on the outside is that it is a it's a material that ages very well, that responds very well to a relatively dusty and muddy climate, especially during the rainy season. And then also it's something that I think everybody who works on the equator is aware of, that of course the particularly, the vertical midday sun is particularly unforgiving when it comes to the slightest irregularities in a wall finish. So obviously to think about or to utilize a more textured wall finish is quite a handy thing to do. You can see that the interior facades of these courtyards are much softer and less textured. And this is a bit of an illustration of what's going on there when the sun hits this facade. We built this as a composite system with a 100mm concrete block on the inside, then linked to the solid brickwork on the outside. The big advantage of that system was that the slowness of the brickwork didn't really slow the entire project down, because we could proceed already, move on to the ring beam, move on to the roof structure, while the masons were still completing the brickwork facade. The entire building has a centralized rainwater harvesting system. You can see very, very shallow and very, very wide galvanized steel gutters that collect the rainwater. They are slightly set apart from the roof. There's a gap in between the gutter and the roof, and that has the purpose of some light being reflected up against the ceiling. This is an outdoor living room. That is a theme that we utilize a lot in our projects. Uganda has a very, very gentle climate, and really life can be outdoors throughout the year. That's the same space seen from the other side. This is the main building courtyard. Then at high level, these windows are quite exposed towards the western evening sun. So we have external louvers that then again reflect the light into the living room. Here one can kind of make out the idea of the gutter, how it is set a little bit apart from the roof, and how there's some light being reflected up against the roof sheet. Again, we used steel here for our columns, but we broke it down into relatively small profiles that can easily be handled, and that are relatively cost efficient. In most of our projects, we timber does appear. We use it carefully, and we select it carefully. We tend to use, in most of our projects, we tend to use eucalyptus as a type of wood that is generally planted in Uganda to a great extent. Most people here love eucalyptus because it's fast. It has its ecological weaknesses as a tree, but for us as users, as architects, we feel that we must use a timber that is from commercial plantations, and then our choice is really, really limited. So that is how we end up using eucalyptus almost in all our projects. There's a lot of passive ventilation going on in these buildings. Most importantly, actually, there's a ventilated ceiling. This diagram shows it, how we actually use something that we call trussed purlins. So the purlins, I don't know whether you see my cursor, but the purlins are actually broken up into a little truss that runs in that direction, runs across the building, so that the air can pass. And we actually have trusses only in a few parts of the building. In the accommodation blocks, we are just using the partition walls of the building. And that allows for a wonderful airflow between the ceiling and the roof sheet, and that makes for incredibly comfortable rooms. We of course also have cross ventilation at lower level, permanent ventilation allowing fresh air to enter from the courtyards, and then high level vents for hot air to leave the building. Generally using reflective roof sheets is a very important aspect. So here this entire project has silver roof sheets which behave best in regards to the indoor comfort. This is the living room seen from the inside. You remember the louvers that I spoke about before that help protecting the indoor from the evening sun, but at the same time there's still a great amount of indirect daylight, even on cloudy days, through the reflective nature of these louvers. There's a little outdoor teaching pavilion in the middle of the agricultural the demonstration gardens here. We really try to use a very similar system to the main building, just really toned down into a very, very simple square structure. We're moving further south. We are now very near Lake Victoria in a place called Kijonjo, although we are not right by the water. And here we were asked to design the extension of an existing monastery called Our Lady of Victoria Monastery. So there was an existing building, you can see that here, that had been built about 10 years ago, and that had very many problems, structural problems. This is a waterlogged site in a sort of a wetland area very near the lake, very flat. But the building had also been built quite poorly, and just before we started work there had been quite a decent earthquake 500 kilometers away, and that really gave the northern wing of the building the rest, and there was no way of maintaining that part of the building, but we decided to keep the rest of the building because there was some emotional and relationship to that building, or there was a history to it for the monks, and then we decided we refurbish it and we build our new building in front. And here you see that this drawing is for whatever reason turned around, but you can see there how the wing shown in red needed to be removed, and how whatever is shown there in black could be retained. This was also quite practical in a way, because the church, which was actually more like a chapel, needed to grow significantly. The reason is that the brotherhood really is doubling in size in the moment, and they started as a very small group, and they are now trying to grow to a total number of 48. This was our first approach to it, that we essentially said we we keep the cloister as it is, but we extend it out southwards such that we create more space for a lounge and for a library, but also for practical reasons that we would be able to build the new church whilst the monks can still use the old chapel. So there was a very simple, practical reason for that. And then we studied the history of Cistercian monasteries in quite some detail. So this is the Cistercian order, which is originally from northern France and from the whole area of Belgium, Holland, etc., but which has grown, all over the world. You find Cistercian monasteries in many parts of the world. This is an interesting, two interesting examples that we studied quite in depth to understand the organization of a monastery, which really dates back to a 1,000-year-old history. But then also the typology of the monastic church, which is very interesting. They are all very, very narrow spaces, very long and very tall. The key difference between such a monastic church and a normal church is that the monks, the brothers, are actually sitting opposite each other in two choirs. And I guess that historically that is what really makes the big difference spatially when it comes to these churches. So this is then how our design developed. You can see there the reddish roof that shows the old building. There's just overlaid in yellow. You can see the part that has been demolished, and then in grayish we are showing the new buildings. Our program was not only to build a church, but also to build a guest house, which is a quadrangle on the top right, and a novitiate. A novitiate is really a building that is intended for the novices who have applied to join the monastery but who have not yet been elevated to the status of a monk, and therefore are not yet actually living around the cloister. And then we added in also the gatehouse, which is something that really came from our studies. The gatehouse has a very important role in the typology of a monastery. It is really the one place where a monastery interacts with the world, with the society, and we felt that this was a very important aspect, so we insisted on that being added to the brief for this project. This was the design, this was the model as we developed it, the idea being that we obviously, through the enormous height of the church that is required in order to achieve these sort of spaces, that we would mitigate that through a particularly low ancillary buildings, guest house, novitiate, and gatehouse. You can see that here, how we essentially try to create 3 levels, with the existing block being in the middle. You see it there in the background, the reddish roofs, and then a particularly downplayed elevation for the ancillary buildings. This is maybe further strengthened by the idea of the rampart wall that we created. There's this inclined textured plinth on which the building sits, and there is a bit of a play going on with so that from the outside you don't really see where the floor is. That kind of helps lowering the buildings visually even further. We decided to work with brick screens. Generally we decided to work with brick, that should be said first, for 2 very simple reasons. The first thing is that the history of the Cistercians is quite interesting in that they do not actually like decoration and abundance and glossiness in the same way that maybe the rest of the Catholic Church is quite known for. When they actually came to us, they said, we want this church to be built exclusively out of material and light. We do not want any color, we don't want any finishes, we don't want any decoration. And we took that quite literal. So the second reason is that Uganda is really the home of clay, and we have fantastic clay all over the place. Therefore, working with brick is generally something that is quite sensible. We used factory brick. We did not use brick that is burnt in local kilns. Main reason being that factory brick is being fired using coffee husk, which is a byproduct of coffee production, whereas the roadside brick, as we call it, is really fired with lots and lots of trees. And Uganda, like all other places, is of course struggling with a huge amount of deforestation. We developed this brickwork language into this idea of these almost curtain-like breeze wall facades, and there is an important need to protect these monasteries. These are very introverted spaces, so there needs to be a certain amount of protection, and at the same time, in a tropical climate, you do want to allow for maximum airflow. So we felt that these breeze walls would be the right answer for that problem. That's the church, the elongated space. You can see there in the center, the two rows that allow the monks to look at each other. The altar on the eastern wall, and then towards the west, a small amount of normal, if you want, church benches for very rare occasions where the community is actually allowed into this monastic church. Importantly, in a monastery, the main entrance is not necessarily the entrance that is shown here on the western side on the right. That door is actually only used in very, very rare occasions. Normally, the monks enter from this from this corridor here that links directly to the chapter room. This is the church space. Obviously, we were fascinated by the barrel vault. That is sort of the most ancient of the Cistercian typologies. They have developed over time, but we were particularly interested in the barrel vault, which is not really a structurally very efficient shape. Lots and lots of moments, lots and lots of forces pushing outward. So we then decided to express these forces in our inclined brickwork buttresses that help bringing this down. But even that lightweight tropical roof that is shown here hovering above also takes on some of those forces. This is a computer image of the church. The idea was really to use a very traditional, or let's say to pick up on the rather traditional typology of the space, the barrel vault, the tall space, very narrow space, but then to subtly invert certain aspects. So you can kind of see that what you would ordinarily expect to be columns are here actually is more like light. We took it quite literal what the monks asked us to do, which is working with material and with light. So we inverted this in a certain way that these recesses that have the windows kind of become the primary structure of the building and then extend upward into the vault, where we inserted bottles into the roof so that the sun then reflects through these down into the space. These are some drone shots during construction. It wasn't easy to build. As you can imagine, this is a very rural site. We didn't use any tower cranes or anything. This was all fully manual. So it was quite some story and took quite some inventive mindset, and 3 years, I should mention. The buttresses here reinforced. So we ended up using a brick that is ordinarily used for passive ventilations above windows, and we use those as our, if you want, as our shutterings to then run steel through and fill concrete in. Some of the construction photos. Here in this photo in the background, you can see how the buttresses become, the inclined buttresses become thicker as you go down, as they pick up more, as they do more work. Again, in the ancillary buildings, we used a very similar system of passive ventilation to the project I showed before. We basically just learned some lessons and improved it. you can see there these trusses, these truss purlins that are running in that direction from partition wall to partition wall, and thereby allow air to pass through. And we use it here for all the covered walkways. We actually use the breeze walls structurally. These are actually, we post-tension them and thereby pull down the gutter, which is in itself a structural member, and thereby did not need to use any columns. There you see the detail how that works. This I mentioned before. This is the textured rampart wall on the outside. There's really we use broken tiles, and there is a certain defensive nature in these monasteries, and we wanted to express that in a certain way. But then, of course, it also makes sense to have a relatively textured, shaded, stepped material at that level, so that backsplash and weathering of the material kind of naturally gets resolved by the design. There's a second little chapel there with another barrel vault that is like a small meditation space that is adjoined to the guest house. These are pictures under construction on the left side of the church. There we were just polishing the concrete floor at the very end. And you can see the altar that is made of a rock, of a boulder, if you want. And then the lower photo on the right is the chapel. This is the novitiate, and with the church in the background. Obviously, the tropical roof that hovers above the church really plays two important roles. One, it protects the building from the rain. We have lots and lots of rain in this country, and a brickwork barrel vaulted building would not necessarily be ideal for this sort of climate. But we are not only protecting it from the water, we're also collecting the rainwater. So generally there's a real water issue on this site. So rainwater is our primary source. And then secondly, of course, we are shading the building, also very important. And there are solar panels, PV panels on top that generate the electricity for the monastery. We are now moving to the most southwestern corner of the country. I noticed that I'm too slow, so I'll have to go a little bit faster now, because I wanted to still share with you two projects. This is an interesting one where we worked with a small group of people called the Batwa. The Batwa are it's a tribe, it's a group of people that live all over Central Africa. And they are traditionally hunters and gatherers living in the rainforests. And they were essentially pushed out of their natural habitat by the guerrilla conservation efforts that started in the mid-90s. So when Uganda created the wildlife reserves that helped saving the gorillas, at the same time they kicked out the Batwa, who were made homeless through this effort. When I got involved in the project, I found a little group of Batwa that were living like this on a tiny stretch of rocky land, and then living really just from handouts in a very, very destitute situation. Our client, our formal client, is the owner of a luxury lodge that obviously works with all the gorillas, and earns their money through gorilla conservation. For them, it was very clear that they wanted to work with the Batwa as well. So they started a long project over many years that involved giving the Batwa an option of selling their crafts and doing dance and music performances. But the actual problem of homelessness was never really resolved. So at some point, our client decided that he wanted to build with them a village on their own piece of land. And that is when we were brought in. And we did that together with them. These are sort of some Batwa guys who are doing performance. But what is interesting about this photo is the building in the background, which actually is a sample building. We gave them some materials. We asked them, can you just build for us a building that you like and that is suitable for you, so that we can then develop a scheme that makes sense for you. And we then rolled it out together with them. They learned how to use the 3 to 4 to 5 rule. They have no formal building knowledge, construction knowledge, but it was a really lovely process of participatory design and construction that ended up with a whole village on the foot of volcanoes. We didn't really draw a plan of this village. We basically just designed it as we went. You see that here. The funny thing is, when we sent up a drone, they took a photo of the village, we realized that the guys had built a lab art, which was really not planned. What you see then in the bottom of that photo is the community center, that circular building. That is actually modeled directly on the traditional forest dwelling of the Batwa. This is how it looks when the garage doors are open. This is sort of a multifunctional community center where performances can take place, but where also the crafts can be made, etc., such things. So it's essentially an enlarged version of the forest dwelling. It was quite interesting to get this structure onto the site with people who do not normally read drawings. I'm really rattling through this very quickly, but we essentially did this in almost like a IKEA sort of how to build a furniture way. And this is how we got the structure right onto the site. Here you see the circles set out, and then we built it step by step as it was shown, and eventually covered it in a steel sheet and then covered it with papyrus. I'm proposing to leave it there. I have one more project, but I notice my time is up unless you guys decide otherwise.
It's perfectly all right, Felix. You can go on, please.
I go on. Okay, then one more project. Two more projects. let me just stop this quickly and.
No issues. I think, Felix, you can.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
You don't mind? Okay. Thanks.
No problem.
So, taking you to Bolisa. I hope you see my screen again.
No, Felix, we cannot see your screen. We'll need to share it again.
Share it, sorry.
Yeah, now it's visible.
Okay, Nile Safari Lodge. So we work in education a lot, but we also work in tourism. We work in any area that allows us to do green architecture. This was an old lodge right by the River Nile. Very, very, very beautiful site with wonderful views over the river, but sadly buildings that really had seen the best of their time and needed to be replaced. So the first thing we always do on such a job, on every job really, is to do a very, very detailed survey of the site, including surveying every single tree. That we develop a very detailed database of trees with height and girth and spread and type and photos and numbering. And that then allows us to design the lodge into the bush, if you want. So the starting point for this lodge was really to say, we want to design a lodge or build a lodge that later on Google Earth is practically not visible. Maybe save for the pools, but the buildings should really blend in with the bush as much as possible. And that led to the idea of using A-frames, because A-frames are generally shapes that blend quite well within the trees. And A-frames are also quite suitable to a wind direction that is normally north-south. This is generally quite a hot climate, so we needed to take care of all of this. And this was really the idea. Going for A-frames both for the main building and for the cottages, but distinguishing quite a bit between these two. So the main building was really intended to be more a roof than a building, very open, and roofs really that are just lightly touching the ground and allowing nature to flow through almost. And then for the accommodation that is not quite practical, as you of course need to be able to enclose it there, we then glaze these A-frames. The main building is not really a building, it's more like some kind of organism, some kind of growth, and it's fully designed by the trees actually. The trees were the main form-giving element for these roofs. You can see that here, how we placed buildings around trees and how we allowed the bush to grow under the building and through the building. Almost more like covered footpaths. And then the A-frames, of course, always allowed for views through into the landscape. And again, every single tree was allowed to remain where it was. There's an infinity pool with a river in the background that was very important to the client, and of course it's also something that the tourists really enjoy. And then we experimented with this diamond-shaped grid utilizing eucalyptus coals. This is a shower in the massage room where we used a dead tree and utilized it as for our overhead shower. This is the typical floor plan of a room. These are always two A-frames that are side by side. One has the bedroom, one has the entrance and the bathroom. So here you can see these sort of twin A-frames. Given the relative large size of each of the rooms, they are 105 square meters, they still help to break the volume down and allow it to blend with the surrounding. Cross ventilation was extremely important. And then of course the view from each room to the river. There's an outdoor bath, an outdoor shower, an indoor shower, side by side. And then each room has its own deck overlooking the river. So now really the last project, we are now almost near Kampala, and that's a school again. And this is a very important project. It's called Mustard Seed. It's important to us because this was our first project that we actually built ourselves. We, with the years, started constructing ourselves, not just designing and overseeing other contractors. This was a client who came to us with 4 pieces of land that were not even joined together and asked us to develop a design for it. One of the sites is located directly in a valley, a conservation site, as we ended up calling it. So here the concept was really to allow rewilding to take place. And then the site on the top left, we ended up calling it a boulder site. Here our project was to develop a sustainable firewood production area, and then our main school site is there at the center. It's a functional plan that we developed. The school is meant to grow over phases, and all of it is actually guided by an understanding of the water cycle. This is the master plan for the site once it is fully developed, but initially we were only focusing on 2 of the buildings, the main entrance building and then the primary school block. These are sort of the key ideas for this school. The client wanted to be very, very, very eco-friendly in their construction. So quite early on, the idea came up to utilize earth bag as our primary construction material and to utilize them as freestanding, almost perimeter walls. And of course, if you do a freestanding perimeter wall, you are worried about stiffness, and therefore the idea of the undulating curved shapes came, and then a roof that hovers above, leaving a gap for permanent ventilation. And then a further important aspect was the idea that we would always want 2 classrooms to form a pair, and that pair would share an outdoor teaching space together that allows learning outside of the classroom as well. That's a typical cross-section through a classroom building, where you can see the very heavy walls that do not touch the roof, and then only where the partition is are we actually going all the way up. No classroom like the other. That was an important criterion that we set ourselves. The idea being that a student really grows through this school and thereby really experiences every year when they move from one classroom to the other, they experience a new world, a new space. I find that quite an interesting idea for the concept of growing through your educational time. Stone foundations, very important. We wanted to be carbon neutral if possible on this project. We were lucky that there was a quarry only 2 kilometers away from the site, so we managed to get all the stone from there. And we excavated all the material that was then used for the walls in order to create the terraces for the buildings. And then we started our earthbag construction, which was a wonderful process. Happened during lockdown, and the guys were literally locked on site, and the supervisors were locked at home and supervised via WhatsApp. There you can see how this technology works, how earth is filled into these bags, and then it is being compacted on the wall itself. Keeping it dry from below is very important, so here we had kind of a triple system of protection with a conventional damp-proof course, but then also with what we call a stone DPC, so 3 layers of very, very dense amphibolite stone, just with a bit of sand that wouldn't allow any moisture to rise up in the wall. Of course, these walls are not stabilized at all. There's no cement in there, there's no lime in there, and therefore it is really, really important to keep it very, very dry. The roof itself is built out of eucalyptus. We had to cut some eucalyptus on site in order to make space for the football pitch, and that then allowed us to do these scissor trusses and partially utilizing those trees. So, samples of lime earth plaster that we utilized for this project, and then the stone pitching at the lower levels. The roof has these, every 3 meters, the roof has a slot in the roof sheets, translucent roof sheets. And here you see some plaster detail. We applied this by hand so that there was a bit of a natural texture in it. And then we added an entire wooden layer on top of the roof sheet. So there's an air gap, and then we used eucalyptus offcuts, and we staggered them. And this has many, or let's say at least 3 reasons. Maybe for the client, the most important reason was that they did not want a metal sheet roof. They did not want to have the industrial look of a metal roof. But then it is also a wonderful shading device if you want. Therefore, the buildings stay beautifully cool below. And then, of course, also the issue of noise is no longer a problem. You can actually teach during heavy downpours, just similar to a clay tile roof. You can see there that these gaps every 3 meters, of course, they're also there in those wooden offcuts, and that then allows light to filter into the classroom. We worked with some women's groups who helped us weaving these beautiful ceiling mats, and we, in order to achieve the transparency where these translucent roof sheets are, we asked them to utilize ordinary drinking straws, plastic drinking straws, to be woven into the grass mat. That allows then the light to filter through. This is a typical classroom when finished. Opening outward towards the shared, covered, partially covered outdoor teaching area. Thank you very much. Thank you for your interest. And those of you who want to know more about us, these are our contacts. You'll find us online.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix. Thank you so much.
Sorry for running over time.
No, I think I didn't feel like stopping you because we're really enjoying the projects that you were sharing. and it was so nice. So I would just like to request you to stop sharing your screen so that we can, and please pardon me for this video resolution. There is something gone wrong. So my face has become a little longer than what you see. So, but I think Felix, we really enjoyed all the 5 buildings that you showed. I mean, starting from a very simple program for school and all the way to a very complex program such as the monastery and the church that you showed. And there's a very interesting use of the local materials, local technology, right? And I have been looking at your website also, and there was one very interesting quote that I actually came across where you're saying that at Localworks, we consider buildings to be spatial organisms rather than iconic sculptures, performing many more roles than can be captured by a glossy photograph in a coffee table book. So there's a very interesting statement here where you're trying to say that the buildings are actually not objects, but these are actually habitats, the places that are meant to be lived and enjoyed, rather than, let's say, iconic sculptures. So that's one part of it. And the second is, of course, coupled with that is your firm's commitment to the sustainability and the ecological issues. I think these two things, they come together and give a wonderful shape to your buildings. Don't you think that this is also a kind of a way, when I look at the title that you have chosen, the appropriate architecture for Uganda, the how question, these two sort of gives you the perfect recipe as to how, the architecture in Africa, particularly in Uganda, can develop.
Yeah, I think this is interesting that you bring those two things together. The idea that a building is not a sculpture and is not predominantly, an icon, has a direct impact on how you design. In other words, on the process of design. So I'm always, Nile Safari is a good example of a building that kind of grew like an organism. So it's not so much manicuring something because you have a certain image in mind and designing from the outside inward. It's actually the other way around. You design from the inside outward, and you create you're looking for certain qualities. You're looking for, you think about what's happening inside and you try to enable what's happening inside. And that's maybe more important than to, as I say, how the glossy photo at the end looks like. So that has a direct impact on how you design, in my opinion. So we enjoy design when it is collaborative, when it is multidisciplinary, when it is when it involves the client or the user very early on, when it's quite hands-on. So we like doing things like building mock-ups, building physical models, trying stuff out, giving up, experimenting. All of those things are really intended towards creating these sort of buildings that I hope are more organisms than objects.
Very true.
And that, of course, now I didn't talk about it too much in my presentation, but that has really directly informed our decision to start building ourselves. So it's not like we started building ourselves because we were looking for another business venture. We did it because I think that as architects we are not celebrating the process enough. That is building, the joy of building, if you want. And that joy of building really starts from the first sketch all the way to finishing the project. And it's such a beautiful, complex, engaging process involving so many people that if you kind of boil this down into this business transaction between an architect and a client and a contractor, it just doesn't do it any. It's just not utilizing all its potential, in my view. So the idea of the architect and the designer and the builder all being the same guys is to me a very beautiful one that I think allows, or let's say that I think makes a positive outcome more likely than not.
Yeah, and also, as you rightly said, that even the process of constructing is equally important. It's not just a design. And in many of the contexts that you are working, I mean, the particular community, Batwa community that you showed, that was displaced by the conservation project. Now, these are places where you will not be able to find conventional contractors, I mean, who would be able to actually get things done for you. So in that sense, don't you think that it becomes natural for it to become a design plus build rather than just design and wait for someone to come and execute it?
I guess that's true. I mean, with endless budget, you can bring a contractor anywhere. But I would say that Batwa project was anyway very unusual, because here, the process of building these buildings was anyway, that was the purpose of the project. So just seeing these guys being elevated and being dignified by being given the opportunity to actually create for them their own village and their own farm and their own, that in itself was the project. That there are some buildings coming out from that, and that's also nice. But the real thing was getting them involved in this thing, designing with them, building with them, learning how to build and learning how to farm. These are completely uprooted people who have really lost absolutely everything. It's quite a traumatic experience that one generation before happened to them. So I guess bringing a contractor in here would have been totally counter the idea. The idea was really, now let's do this together. And let's see what comes out of it. So very, very interesting project. But you are right in the sense that I think this experience probably increased our confidence in saying we can look for unconventional ways of doing stuff. There's enough people who do the conventional stuff very well. Let's not compete with those guys. Let's become more confident in our own abilities, and let us build up a real good and tight team of craftsmen. Let's even invest in these craftsmen, let's teach them, and with time, let's get better and better and better at what we're doing.
Wonderful. I think, and this is with many people. I mean, we've been talking to the people who have been working with participatory design approaches, community development projects, and it becomes a more natural sort of extension for it to be a design and build rather than just design. And it is, once again, in your case, it was completely reinforced that idea. I just wanted to understand about the Localworks and as a practice. And you mentioned that research is a very, very important component as part of your practice. So what kind of research projects you are working on, and how does research help in in taking further steps?
It's very, very applied. It's very applied research. So in other words, it is informed by a need for a particular project, and it is normally around about materials and the right application for these materials. So in our early years, I think most of our research was really around earth construction, because there's a lot that we needed to learn. There's so many different types of earth construction. Right now, we are doing a bamboo project, which is also, again, something that is not so common here, not as common as in Asia. In Africa, it's still very, very unusual. So we're learning and applying. Then we have another interesting project that our research team, if you want, is doing. That is we're looking for ways of doing a prefabricated accommodation, but ecological and eco-friendly. We call it eco-prefab. And for that, we have developed a certain infill block. So these are kind of things that we mean by research. It's not particularly academic, it's not particularly scientific yet, but we do have that ambition also to become slightly more scientific in how we conduct this research, and not being only directly interested in the outcome for our project. I think that's something that we can grow in with time.
Yeah, and I'm sure it works both ways. I mean, the research informing the practice, and then of course the practice, the experience that we are gaining from the site, going and again giving feedback to the research.
Correct. And also critically, these are all the same people. That is very important about this whole idea of designing, building, researching, and we call it sharing. We have 4 pillars in Localworks, and these are all the same guys. So the designers and the builders, we're trying to blur the boundary as much as we can. So ideally, when we do a mock-up, it's the site guys who come into the office and work together with the architects and the engineers and build that mock-up. And that will, of course, mean that the builder already during design stage already understands what's coming in 6 months and has already got a good understanding of the problem. And vice versa, I think an architect working directly with a builder and basically sharing the tools will, of course, design in much more sensible detail. There's no doubt about it if you actually try it out physically. And researching as well. These are the guys who do the research, who do the experimentation. I think overall, as architects, we need to really understand the material and we need to understand the application of it. I think the more practical, the more hands-on that's done, the better.
We have one question from Mr. Dio on Facebook where he's asking how does the community react to the clay bricks? I mean, it's generally considered as a kind of a poor material or material for the poor or something like that.
So does he mean the clay brick or does he mean the earth blocks? Because
clay bricks. So
the clay bricks certainly here, the manufactured clay bricks that we used for the project in Kamuli and for the monastery, they are not considered here as inferior materials. They actually have quite a good reputation. Even you find some rich people in the city who use them as material, maybe as cladding. Not necessarily as a structural material, but I don't think there is a lot of convincing to be done. With earth, it's a bit different. I think building with earth is something that requires the right type of client, the right type of user, the right type of community, and it does require explaining because people have a natural, tendency to believe it is kind of inferior, old-fashioned. Their grandparents lived in those houses. Why do they have to live in them? And of course, we are now very busy trying to explain them that we are innovating. We are utilizing them in a completely controlled way, where let's say the school in Kidepo is designed exactly for 50 years, just like any other conventional building is designed to as well. And the compressed earth blocks that we did on that project actually have a better, higher load-bearing capacity than concrete blocks, believe it or not.
Yeah, I do. I mean, most of these CSCB, the compressed earth blocks, and even the rammed earth construction had a pretty good compressive strength, and that I think it's been proven now with a lot of people using it. So it's just about common people, the way they perceive it, and also many times the way the governments actually define what here in India, for example, it's defined as a cement construction, as a Pakka construction. Pakka means the solid, and everything else is kacha. Kacha means temporary. So these are also sort of things that go in giving shape to the perception in common people's mind. But I think I'm sure you're able to explain them. We have one question from his name is Daniel Rovotomio, and he's a second year architecture student, and is asking about stone foundation from Uganda University, one of the universities studying in second year, saying that notice in most of your projects you use stone foundations. Why do you use stone foundations and not any other type of foundation? Which I think partially, yeah, please go.
I think I mentioned that a little bit. So the primary consideration is moisture, but then it's also a very eco-friendly way of building if you have stone nearby. If you compare that maybe with concrete blocks, with strip foundations, etc. These are not just stones that you don't just dig a trench and throw stone and you actually pack these. These are essentially dry stack stone walls underground. You don't want too much movement in that. And then there is a beam over it. We tie them together with a reinforced concrete beam. But it's still a very, very efficient type of foundation. And we keep forgetting that cement was not there all forever, and cement is a very, very short period of time in our history, 120, 130 years. All those centuries before, that is what was used for foundations, and it's very, very successful.
Yeah, and I assume that the soil is very good. I mean, you don't have to go too much below the ground for you to get a good soil bearing capacity. So I think most of the foundations that I saw are just about a couple of feet dug into, and then the stone. And this is a very common practice here. If you have heard of an Indian architect, Laurie Baker, I'm sure you must have heard of him. And this was a very common thing. So the stone is something that is available. So just about 1.5 feet wide wall, rubble masonry, and from straight away he used to do rat trap bond masonry, and a very common and a sensible thing to do. So I think you have answered most of the questions. Just if you have some time, just a couple of questions we take and then we call it a day. I think we've just overshot by 10 minutes. Just wanted to ask you a question. You've been working, Felix, for many years in Africa. I mean, you came in 2004. You started working with a firm. Then you established your own firm. It was FH Architects. And then later on, now you came together, a couple of consortium, 3 firms, and now you have the Localworks. You've been working for all these years in a context that is stranger to you. You've been born and brought up in Germany. What has been your experience like? What are the key challenges that you've faced over these years?
For me, I've never worked as an architect in Germany. I've studied there, and then immediately after studying, I came here for various reasons. And one of the reasons was that I was not really interested being an architect in a completely built-up environment. Yeah, the global north, since you've spoken about the global south, the global north is so overdeveloped that I felt like there is just no room to breathe as an architect. It just didn't interest me. And whenever I was in Africa, I traveled a lot in Africa as a student. Whenever I was here, I saw a lot of opportunity everywhere. I saw a lot of, basically the potential was just endless. And that is what attracted me as an architect, because I believe in the ability of design. I believe in our role in shaping the world. And I was more interested in doing that here than there. Add to that of course, Uganda is a particularly, if you want, easy country to move into as a foreigner, and it's quite it's a very welcoming culture. So it's also very open for business. So all of these put together made me settle here and work here. And I would say our biggest challenge is actually the skills issue. So that is why Localworks puts so much effort on skilling craftsmen, but even architects. And basically, we are almost like we consider ourselves a bit like an academy. We are basically we're trying to train and we're trying to multiply, and the more people we can affect and the more people we can teach them, because that is what is most missing here, is the actual skill of building. That's maybe what makes at times achieving good architecture quite a challenge. But in principle, it's a lovely challenge. It's an enjoyable challenge, because I don't find it so interesting to just specify a product. I find it more interesting to actually make it. And that's what we do here.
Yeah, it was really nice. Felix, thank you so much. It was really wonderful. And let me start by thanking Localworks that you agreed, you came for the interview, you gave us your wonderful time, and you shared your projects with us. It was really wonderful to see your work personally, hear from you, learn the processes, and the chance of interaction that I've had with you. It was really nice interacting with you. Thank you so much, Felix. On behalf of ArchiDiaries, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And just to sort of conclude it, I would like to thank the people who have joined with us on social media platforms. Just one announcement, we have our fifth and hopefully the last interview of the series that will be that has been postponed to June 18th. The interview is going to be with a very interesting architecture firm based in Asuncion, Paraguay, called Grupo Culata Jova. It's a collaborative practice dedicated to sustainable architecture. So I look forward to see you guys back on June 18th. Thank you so much for joining with us.
Thank you.